Al Capone, the gangster who smiled while Chicago bled. Imagine a man who walked the streets of Chicago like he owned them, because he did. He wore silk suits that cost more than most people made in a year. He drank the finest whiskey while the rest of America went dry during Prohibition. He tipped waiters with $100 bills, even during the Great Depression, when families were losing their homes. He walked like a king, smiled like a movie star, and ordered killings over breakfast like he was discussing the weather because, to him, murder was just business. Al Capone didn't skulk in dark alleys like other criminals. He ran Chicago in broad daylight, under the flash of newspaper cameras and the glow of neon signs. He bribed cops by the dozen. Judges sat in his pocket like spare change. Even the mayor answered his phone calls. He fed the hungry and gunned down his enemies before lunch. This isn't just the story of a gangster. This is the story of America's first celebrity criminal, a man who rewrote the rules of organized crime, lived like royalty, and fell harder than anyone thought possible. This is the story of Alphonse Gabriel Capone, Scarface, the King of Chicago. January 17, 1899. Brooklyn, New York. Al Capone was born into a world of honest poverty. His parents, Gabrielle and Teresa, were Italian immigrants who believed in hard work and keeping your head down. His father cut hair in a modest barbershop. His mother stitched clothes late into the night by candlelight. But young Alphonse, he had bigger dreams than a barber's chair and a rented apartment in a crowded tenement. He was smarter than his teachers gave him credit for. But he was also restless, angry, and hungry for something more than the quiet life his parents had planned for him. At 14, everything changed. A teacher humiliated him in front of the class, calling him stupid. Al's fists moved faster than his brain. One punch, the teacher hit the floor. Al was expelled and never returned to school. By 15, he was running with street gangs. The Navy Street Boys, the South Brooklyn Rippers. These weren't just groups of kids causing trouble, they were training grounds for future criminals. Al learned to fight, to scheme, and most importantly, to never show weakness. At 18, his life changed forever during a night that would give him his most famous nickname. He was working as a bouncer at a seedy bar when he made a crude comment to a young woman. Her brother, Frank Galluccio, didn't appreciate the disrespect. 3 quick slashes with a knife. 3 permanent scars across Al's left cheek. From that night on, he was Scarface, though he hated the name. In every photograph, he'd turn his head to hide the scars. When reporters asked about them, he'd lie and say they were war wounds from fighting in France. But Al Capone never served his country. He only served himself. His real education began when he started working for Frankie Yale, a successful mobster who controlled gambling and bootlegging operations across Brooklyn. Yale saw potential in the scarred young man with quick fists and quicker thinking. Al ran numbers. He delivered illegal alcohol. He collected debts with interest and intimidation. But Brooklyn was getting crowded. Too many bosses, too many bullets, not enough territory to go around. Then came the phone call that would change everything. Johnny Torrio, a powerful Chicago mobster, needed reliable muscle in the Windy City. He'd heard about the tough kid from Brooklyn with the scarred face and the steel nerves. In 1919, 20-year-old Al Capone boarded a train with a single suitcase and a pocket full of brass knuckles. He was heading to a city that would soon bow to his will. Chicago in the 1920s was a city transformed. Prohibition had turned every street corner into a potential gold miner. Few were willing to shed blood for it. The law said no alcohol, but the people wanted to drink. And where there's demand, There's always someone willing to supply for the right price. Capone started as Johnny Torrio's lieutenant, managing speakeasies, protecting shipments, and convincing stubborn police officers to look the other way. But Al was never content to stay in second place. He studied Torrio's methods like a scholar: how to organize, how to delegate, how to make the maximum profit with the minimum risk. But most importantly, he learned that in Chicago, reputation was everything. February 1925, Torrio barely survived an assassination attempt by rival gang members. As he lay in his hospital bed, riddled with bullets but still breathing, he made a decision that would reshape Chicago's criminal landscape. He was done. The stress, the violence, the constant threat of death, it wasn't worth it anymore. He handed everything over to his ambitious protege and retired to Italy with his millions. At just 26 years old, Al Capone was now the undisputed boss of the Chicago outfit. He moved into the Lexington Hotel, transforming the top floors into his fortress. Bulletproof doors, armed bodyguards in every hallway, phone lines to every important politician, judge, and police chief in the city. This wasn't just bootlegging anymore. Capone controlled gambling dens where fortunes were won and lost nightly. He ran brothels where Chicago's elite satisfied their secret desires. He controlled labor unions, deciding who worked and who didn't. The money flowed like Lake Michigan, endless and unstoppable. Conservative estimates put his annual income at $100 million. All of it illegal. All of it untouchable. But here's what made Capone different from every other gangster in American history. He didn't hide. While other crime bosses lurked in shadows, Capone courted publicity like a Hollywood star. He gave interviews to reporters. He posed for photographs. He attended boxing matches, baseball games, and opera performances, always in the front row where everyone could see him. He wore custom-tailored suits that cost more than a teacher's annual salary. He drove bulletproof Cadillacs with armed escorts. He owned restaurants, nightclubs, and even a farm in Wisconsin where he entertained politicians and celebrities. To the struggling masses of Chicago, Al Capone wasn't just a criminal, he was a folk hero. During the Depression, when the government failed to feed the hungry, Capone opened soup kitchens that served thousands of meals daily. He paid medical bills for families who couldn't afford doctors. He gave jobs to men who couldn't find work anywhere else. The newspapers called him Big Al and the philanthropist Gangster. To many, he was Robin Hood with a Tommy gun. But the reality was much darker. Capone's generosity came with a price: absolute loyalty and total fear. Cross him, and you disappeared. Question his authority, and your family received flowers at your funeral. He ruled Chicago not through love, but through calculated terror. By 1925, Chicago was divided like a medieval kingdom. The North Side gang controlled the wealthy neighborhoods. The South Side outfit belonged to Capone, and every street corner between them was a potential battlefield. This wasn't just competition, it was war. Capone ordered bombings that shattered storefronts and terrified civilians. Drive-by shootings became so common that mothers kept their children indoors after dark. Machine guns chattered through the night like deadly percussion in Chicago's bloody symphony. Police officers faced an impossible choice: accept Capone's bribes and look the other way, or risk their lives trying to enforce laws that half the city wanted broken. Capone once told a reporter, "You can get much further with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone." It wasn't a joke, it was his business philosophy. But his masterpiece of terror was still to come. February 14, 1929, Valentine's Day, a day that would prove Al Capone's ruthlessness knew no bounds. 7 members of the rival North Side gang were lured to a garage on North Clark Street. They thought they were meeting bootleggers to buy stolen whiskey. Instead, they walked into a trap that would shock the entire nation. Capone's men arrived dressed as police officers. The North Side gangsters, thinking it was just another routine raid, lined up against the wall without resistance. No warning, no arrests, no mercy. 70 rounds from Thompson submachine guns. 7 men dead in minutes. No survivors. Capone had planned it perfectly. He was hundreds of miles away in Florida, establishing an airtight alibi while his enemies bled out on a cold garage floor. The St. Valentine's Day massacre made front-page news across America. Even in a city accustomed to violence, this was too much. Politicians who had ignored Capone's activities for years were suddenly forced to act. The federal government decided that Chicago's king had to fall. Al Capone had machine guns, millions of dollars, and mayors in his pocket. But what he didn't have was a receipt book, and that oversight would destroy him. The US government had tried everything. Raids that found empty warehouses, arrests that ended in acquittals, surveillance that revealed nothing prosecutable. Capone was too smart, too powerful, and too careful. So they changed tactics. They wouldn't go after the bodies, they'd go after the books. Enter Elliot Ness, a young, incorruptible federal agent with steel nerves and an impossible mission. Bring down the most powerful criminal in American history. Ness assembled a hand-picked team of agents who earned the nickname the Untouchables because they were the only federal agents not on Capone's payroll. They launched coordinated raids on Capone's breweries. They seized his delivery trucks and destroyed his equipment. They cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars and damaged his reputation for invincibility. But it wasn't enough. Capone adapted, rebuilt, and continued making millions. Then investigators discovered Capone's fatal flaw. Behind all the violence and glamour was a simple truth. Al Capone never filed income taxes. For years, he claimed to have no legitimate income, no job, no business, just a regular citizen who happened to wear $1,000 suits and owned million-dollar properties. Federal accountants began following paper trails through Chicago's underground economy. They found coded ledgers that detailed illegal profits, hidden bank accounts stuffed with unreported cash, payroll records that proved Capone's criminal enterprise was worth millions. Finally, they had enough evidence to bring charges that would stick. October 1931, the trial of the century began in a Chicago courthouse, surrounded by more security than a presidential visit. Al Capone, impeccably dressed as always, smirked at photographers and waved to crowds like he was running for office. He had corrupted judges before. He had bought juries like groceries. This would be no different. But at the last minute, the judge switched juries. 12 men who had never heard of Al Capone's bribes. 12 citizens who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated. For the first time in his criminal career, Al Capone was cornered. The verdict: guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. The sentence: 11 years in federal prison and massive fines. The untouchable king of Chicago was going to prison over unpaid taxes. First, they sent him to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. But even behind bars, Capone tried to pull strings and buy privileges, so the government transferred him to the most isolated prison in America, Alcatraz Island. The Rock: no visitors, no phone calls, no bribes, no escape. But Capone faced an enemy that bullets couldn't stop and money couldn't cure. Syphilis. The disease had been attacking his brain for years. In prison, without proper treatment, it accelerated. He became paranoid, delusional. Fellow inmates reported hearing him talk to invisible visitors and play his banjo alone for hours, lost in memories of his former power. In 1939, after serving 7.5 years, Capone was released early due to his deteriorating mental condition. But the man who returned to his Florida mansion was a shadow of the king who once ruled Chicago. January 25, 1947. Al Capone died of cardiac arrest in his Florida home. He was 48 years old. He didn't die in a blaze of gunfire. There was no final shootout, no last stand against the law. The most powerful gangster in American history was erased by taxes, disease, and time. But his legacy endures. Al Capone showed the world what organized crime could become: a brand, a business, a spectacle. He blurred the lines between outlaw and icon, between villain and folk hero. Because, for one bloody decade, Chicago didn't have a government. It had a king. And his name was Al Capone. If this gave you chills, there's more where that came from. Subscribe to UTAK Diaries for the most twisted true crime deep dives, historical nightmares, and stories that stay with you long after the video ends. Drop a comment if you made it to the end. And remember, the most dangerous people are the ones you'd never suspect.